You stand at the threshold of an Athenian house after nightfall, where the street outside smells of crushed olives and dust, and the air is so still you can hear each sandal scuff the stones. Within, the symposium has already begun. A slave pulls back the curtain and heat breathes out, wine sour, resinous, thick with lamp smoke. Lyres murmur somewhere beyond the first room, their strings tuned to the same complacent mood that floats through the city on victorious nights. Beyond, a procession of cups glints like a minor constellation. You step inside because everyone you must impress has already done so, because not entering would be noticed, and because in this city, reputation is a currency harsher than bronze. The floor is spread with woven rugs, soft beneath your feet, a deliberate contrast to the cool, scratched stone of the courtyard. Oil lamps hang from bronze hooks and throw light that glosses the room in molten gold. The men recline on couches around low tables, their fingers stained red by the first mixing bowl, the crater where wine and water are married at a ratio decided by the host. Laughter strikes the air like thrown coins, bright, brittle, performative. The sound is so vigorous you might mistake it for happiness, but it is the sort of laughter men learn to use as armor. A flute girl plays a drifting line, and conversation braids itself around the music talk of treaties, of plays, of a new statue on the Acropolis whose drapery looks more like wind than stone. Names of philosophers are scattered like seeds: Socrates, Protagoras, men who argue about virtue while the city curls itself into a myth of reason. Democracy is praised, free speech is toasted, the gods are invoked with a ceremonial piety that smells faintly of theater masks and olive wreaths. On the walls, painted scenes from old myths display desire and pursuit as if the world were born to be chaste. Then the curtain at the far end stirs. The laughter does not stop, it merely shifts register. Servants enter first quiet, efficient, anonymous in the way that labor is taught to be. Behind them come figures the guests will notice because they must. Some are boys with hair still clipped in the style of the gymnasium, their eyes lowered, their faces studied into neutrality. Others are women whose names are not recorded anywhere you will later read. A few are older slaves, bodies marked by use in ways that do not require language. No one announces the purpose of this display. No one needs to. The machinery of expectation runs too smoothly to creak. The room does not turn feral, it does not need to. The cruelty here is not a frenzy, but a design. Voices soften, become kind, become appraising, become gentle as a hand on the bridle. Questions are asked the way a buyer might ask about grain, age, training, origin. In a corner, two men debate a line of poetry about self-restraint, while their eyes weigh skin and posture. A guest recites a fragment on the soul's pursuit of the beautiful, and then, without visible irony, nods toward a trembling shoulder as if truth had just arrived wearing another person's body. Your cup rises to your mouth and the wine blooms hot, sweet, unwatered for this round. Resin from the amphora ghosts your tongue. The room grows warmer, or perhaps your stomach has lit a lantern of its own. You feel the moral temperature shift, incremental, almost polite, as if the entire night were a slope no one admits they are descending. This is how a city tells itself a story about excellence while training its citizens to ignore what excellence costs. Listen. The lyre changes mode, the flute dips, and the talk becomes anecdote. Who visited which house, who impressed which judge, which boy showed promise at the wrestling school, which woman learned to pour wine with a grace that seems like consent. The details are specific because specificity protects the conscience. It turns people into cases, cases into tradition, tradition into inevitability. Again and again, the same phrases return. Custom, mentorship, festival, divine sanction, liturgical words that peel responsibility off the skin like old wax. Someone jokes that philosophy is best practiced in good company, and the room obliges by becoming worse company with remarkable speed. The host praises moderation while encouraging excess. Another Athenian art. A slave refills your cup at the precise angle that spills no drop, and you catch a whiff of fear on the servant's breath. That metallic, skin-close smell that never makes it into the plays because plays are for public virtue. Here, in the private theater of the powerful, the virtues reverse themselves. Discipline is imposed on the powerless. Freedom becomes an instrument rather than an ideal. You watch a hand beckon. You watch a face harden into compliance. You watch the city's gods invoked to bless what power has already decided to take. It is not the noise that horrifies you. It is the arrangement. How well it all fits together, how the couches are placed to stage the gaze, how the lamps are hung to soften any mark into something almost painterly, how the host's voice never rises because he never needs to raise it. Consent, here, is a script written by those who never have to perform it. From the courtyard comes the faintest clatter of a dropped ladle, and silence hits the outer servants like weather. Inside, a guest performs a toast to reason. The word moves across the room like a ceremonial boat, carried by hands that have never rowed. In this Athens, your Athens rationality and appetite clasp wrists, each lifting the other under the guise of virtue. The line between education and exploitation blurs until it can be described as tradition, and once named thus, it becomes almost unassailable. Your throat tightens. You are not a hero. You are an observer who understands that to protest is to become the story for all the wrong reasons. The room offers you a choice it has already made. The host smiles because nothing tonight will surprise him. The city outside sleeps under the Parthenon, white as a promise. Within these rooms, the promises are rewritten. The words that built marble temples have learned to walk in the dark. This is not a story. This was celebrated culture. Do not look away from the contradiction. It is the point. A civilization that carved beauty out of stone also learned to carve silence into people. A city that taught the world to argue learned also to arrange bodies into lessons the law would not name. Again and again, generation after generation, the public myth and the private practice powered each other like oars pulling the same boat through the same black water. You could tell yourself that this was an exception, that only a few men, only a few houses, only a few nights. But the evidence of design is everywhere, in the architecture of the room, in the vocabulary of custom, in the way even discomfort here has been taught to stay quiet. And because the city insists on calling this moderation, it becomes, with terrible efficiency, normal. Step back with me from the lamplit couches and the curated laughter. Step into the larger night where Athens glows like a kiln, hardening its ideals in the heat of its appetites. If you would understand how a people so devoted to reason could defend what happened in these rooms, you must learn the grammar of their self-justification, the rituals, the laws, the philosophies enlisted to dress appetite in civic robes. Only then can you see how the mask was made and why it fits so well. Hold that image, the temple and the threshold, the law and the lamp, and we will widen the frame. What you have witnessed is not a rumor, not a scandal whispered by enemies, but a pattern with a vocabulary of its own. In the next part, we will read that vocabulary, the social order that normalized it, the thinkers who argued around it, the festivals and institutions that endowed it with the weight of custom. The city teaches what it is by what it permits. To grasp the design, we must study the blueprint. Step outside the dim, perfumed chamber of the symposium, and the city opens before you like a marble stage. Athens in the 5th century BCE, white columns blazing in the Mediterranean sun, the Parthenon still smelling of newly hewn stone, the agora thrumming with merchants hawking grain, fish, and papyrus. Here is the city celebrated as the cradle of reason, where words are sharpened like blades in debate, where democracy is proclaimed as the highest order of civic life. You walk among men who call themselves free, who raise their voices in assembly to decide questions of war and law. The polis exalts itself as a temple of enlightenment. But beneath the rhetoric of freedom lies another rhythm, steady and unquestioned, the rhythm of ownership. Slaves compose a third, sometimes even half of the city's population. Women are walled inside houses, their public presence diminished to shadows. And the symposium, the gathering of elites that Athens treats as both entertainment and education, becomes the chamber where those contradictions bleed most visibly into flesh. Imagine the ritual. Men recline on couches, each with a slave or concubine assigned to pour wine, to massage shoulders, to serve fruit, to perform music. The wine itself is never drunk unmixed. It is diluted in the great crater, because Greeks believed only barbarians drank it strong. But moderation was in name only. The evening always drifted toward excess, and as the mixing bowls emptied and were filled again, conversation loosened, inhibitions thinned, and the performances grew darker. For the Greeks, this was not a private vice, but an institution. The symposium was as formal as a play in the theater. Games were played, speeches delivered, poetry recited, and woven into that structure was the display of bodies. Slaves might be ordered to dance naked, to perform sexual acts for the amusement of men who toasted philosophy with one hand and pointed with the other. To the modern ear, the word itself trembles. But to Athens, pederasty, sexual relationships between adult men and adolescent boys, was framed as pedagogy, mentorship, even virtue. The Erastes, the older man, was expected to guide his Eromenos, the beloved youth, not only in the arts of war and rhetoric, but also in the arts of intimacy. This was institutionalized, celebrated in pottery, poetry, and even the writings of philosophers. Plato himself, whose dialogues still line university shelves, wrote in the Symposium that love between men could ascend to something divine, provided it was directed toward beauty and wisdom. Xenophon defended the practice, Aristotle noted it without horror, and the orators of Athens, men like Aeschines, used it as rhetorical ammunition. Accusing an opponent of being the passive partner was not to condemn the relationship itself, but to shame the man's lack of dominance. In Sparta, the practice was codified as part of military training. Boys of 12 were taken into mentorships with older warriors, their bond supposedly a foundation for loyalty on the battlefield. What in Athens was draped in rhetoric of philosophy, in Sparta was baptized as necessity of war. Again and again, you see the pattern. What we would call exploitation was called instruction. What we would call abuse was called tradition. Consider the other half of the population. Wives, mothers, daughters kept almost invisible in public life. Athenian women were married off by 14 or 15, their worth measured in dowry and obedience. They were barred from the symposium, from politics, from philosophy. When sexual need directed itself toward them, it was often through the walls of state-regulated brothels. Solon, the celebrated lawgiver, had institutionalized prostitution in Athens. Women, bought and sold, became taxable property of the polis. They stood behind doors with prices marked, the profits lining state coffers. And then there were the hetairai, the courtesans. Educated, witty, permitted to attend symposia because their role was to entertain with both conversation and flesh. They were exceptions that proved the rule. Women granted a stage only by becoming spectacle. Yet even this was not enough. Desire must always disguise itself, must clothe itself in higher robes. Religion became the garment. Fertility festivals such as the Dionysia and the rites of Demeter at Eleusis carried undercurrents of sexuality. Dionysus, the god of wine and frenzy, was worshipped with ecstatic dances, masks, and processions that hinted at ritualized coupling. In the Thesmophoria, women gathered apart from men to invoke fertility, their rituals whispered about but never described in detail by male authors, an absence that itself suggests taboo. In the Bacchic rites, madness and intoxication became divine permission, a sacred license to let the body cross the boundaries of shame. The line between sacred ritual and sexual indulgence blurred, until even the philosophers struggled to tell them apart. In Euripides's Bacchae, the god himself justifies chaos, and the chorus sings of freedom that looks very much like surrender. What we know of these practices comes not from gossip, but from the pens of historians and poets themselves. Aristophanes, in his comedies, mocks the excesses of symposia with knowing laughter, his jokes working only because the audience recognized the truth. Vase paintings, red figure and black figure, depict Erastes and Eromenos in intimate poses, everyday objects adorned with scenes we would consider obscene. These were not hidden, not marginal. They were displayed in homes, sold in markets, treasured as art. Later, Roman moralists would recoil. Plutarch and Athenaeus, looking back, described the Greeks' excesses with a mixture of fascination and condemnation. But in Athens' own time, it was not seen as excess. It was the fabric of culture. Stand again in the agora. Here the philosophers dispute virtue beneath the open sky, while not far away the brothel doors creak on their hinges. Watch citizens vote on freedom in the assembly, while slaves line up at the fountain to carry water back to their masters. The paradox does not weaken the city, it feeds it. Athens becomes luminous precisely because it can hide its shadows in plain sight. You see the contradiction sharpen. The polis that celebrates reason also rationalizes desire. The city that praises freedom restricts it. The men who carve ideals into stone etch cruelty into flesh. Innocence and horror, virtue and appetite, democracy and domination, woven together like threads of the same cloak. This was not hypocrisy in their eyes, it was coherence. They saw no contradiction. And that is what makes it most disturbing. When a civilization believes its cruelty is not a failing but a feature, the practices are not hidden. They are performed with pride. What began as education and ritual soon demanded escalation. Power never rests, it invents. Once society accepts flesh as currency, the market expands and the powerful search for ever more elaborate ways to consume it. What started as mentorship, as religious frenzy, as custom, metastasized into theater, into spectacle, into perversions designed not only to gratify but to humiliate. And so the slope steepens. The symposium becomes a stage, the brothel a laboratory, the temple a mask. The appetite of the powerful becomes a force that no law will check. Now step with me deeper into those rooms, into the rituals of power and pleasure, where cruelty learned to dress itself as entertainment. The symposium has ended for the night, but the aftertaste remains. The laughter still echoes in your skull like wine clinging to the tongue, and the images refuse to leave you. Yet this was only the threshold. What you have glimpsed was not the full descent, but merely the opening act of a society where appetite was structured, ritualized, and exalted. To understand how deep it went, you must walk with me into the sanctuaries, the brothels, the hidden chambers of Greece, where desire was no longer disguised as education, but celebrated as performance, worship, and power. Imagine the festival of Dionysus, the god of wine, of ecstasy, of theater itself. His worship was not serene, it was a storm. By day, Athens staged plays in his honor, tragedies dripping with blood and hubris, comedies mocking the most sacred customs. But at night, the mask of art peeled away, and the rituals became darker. Women especially were swept into the Bacchic rites. The Maenads, draped in fawn skins, carrying the thyrsus, a staff tipped with ivy and pine. They danced until exhaustion stripped away inhibition, voices breaking into shrieks that were said to be both divine and terrifying. In these rites, frenzy was worship, intoxication was holiness, and the boundaries between sanctity and carnality blurred until they dissolved completely. Ancient sources whisper of orgiastic coupling in the forests outside the city, of bodies offered as sacrifice to the god of abandon. Euripides' Bacchae dramatizes this very terror, mothers tearing apart their sons in divine ecstasy, women possessed by lust and madness. Whether every story is literal or not is almost beside the point. The perception was enough. In Greece, to worship could mean to surrender, and to surrender meant giving your body not only to a god, but to those who claimed to serve him. Not all rites were so chaotic. Some were wrapped in silence, in secrecy so profound that even centuries later their details remain elusive. The Eleusinian mysteries, dedicated to Demeter and Persephone, drew pilgrims from across the Greek world. Initiates swore oaths never to reveal what occurred within the sacred hall of Eleusis. What little we know suggests rituals of symbolic death and rebirth, of sacred drink called kykion, of torches and midnight processions. Yet ancient rumors also hint at sexual undertones. Fertility was at the core of these rites, the cycle of grain, the descent and return of Persephone. To invoke fertility meant invoking sex, and some accounts suggest ritualized coupling, symbolic acts of penetration enacted before the initiates as cosmic theater. If true, these ceremonies fused spirituality with voyeurism, ensuring that even the most sacred mysteries carried an undertone of flesh. Step away from the sanctuaries and into the alleys near the agora. Here stand the brothels, simple, functional, state-owned. Solon, the revered lawgiver, had established them centuries earlier. Athenian men could purchase sex as easily as bread or olives, and the city profited from every transaction. Women inside were slaves, often foreigners, brought from Thrace, Asia Minor, or beyond. Their lives were stripped down to routine, locked in small rooms, branded, priced according to youth or rarity. Some were sold to dozens of men in a single day. The state recorded their earnings, taxed their bodies, and folded their degradation into the machinery of the polis. To Athens, this was not shameful but practical. It preserved respectable wives from suspicion by offering men a sanctioned outlet. The rhetoric of philosophers praised moderation, while the law itself institutionalized exploitation. Innocence and horror again braided into one. There was, however, another tier, the hetairai, courtesans of higher status. Unlike brothel slaves, they could be educated, witty, companions in both bed and conversation. Some, like Aspasia of Miletus, became renowned for their intellect, even influencing statesmen like Pericles. Yet even this apparent empowerment was built upon spectacle. Hetairai were invited to symposia not as equals but as adornments, expected to dance, sing, and perform sexually before audiences of men. Their cleverness was tolerated only so long as it entertained. They occupied a paradox, freer than wives, yet never free at all. In the most decadent houses, cruelty itself became a kind of performance. Imagine a symposium where the wine has deepened into stupor and the guests demand novelty. Slaves, often boys or girls, were ordered to enact scenes for the amusement of the room. Sometimes they were forced to parody myths, acting out stories of gods coupling or pursuing mortals. Other times they were made to copulate openly, their humiliation treated as comedy or instruction. The audience laughed, toasted, recited lines from Homer or Aristophanes, while human beings were reduced to props. There are accounts of competitions who could last longest, who could endure the most degrading command. The cruelty was not hidden, it was aestheticized, turned into theater with bodies as the stage. To sustain such acts, the Greeks draped them in religion. Aphrodite, goddess of love, had temples where sacred prostitution was rumored, especially in Corinth. Pilgrims offered coins and received union with a priestess as though it were sacrifice. Whether every report is accurate or exaggerated, the idea itself reflects a cultural truth. Sex could be sanctified, lust could be framed as devotion. When gods themselves were portrayed as promiscuous, Zeus descending in disguise to seduce or assault, Dionysus spreading frenzy, Aphrodite inciting desire, mortals claimed divine precedent. The cruelty of the powerful was excused as imitation of Olympus. At this stage, a turning point emerges. When society treats flesh as entertainment, ritual, and currency, boundaries collapse. What began as mentorship, as sacred fertility, as tradition, metastasizes. Victims are no longer individuals, but categories, the boy as a Romanos, the slave as toy, the woman as vessel. This was the irreversible shift, the moment when practices no longer required justification. They had become self-sustaining. Athenian art depicted them openly, law profited from them, religion cloaked them, philosophy debated them. There was no outside, no refuge. Pause here and consider the victims. Imagine a Thracian girl, no more than 12, brought in chains, her language foreign, her body priced by a city that prided itself on dialogue. Imagine a boy in the gymnasium, told his submission was a step toward virtue, his terror interpreted as shyness. Imagine a wife, silenced behind walls, knowing her husband's nights were spent in rooms where laughter drowned out screams. These were not isolated cruelties, but systemic, repeating, normalized. Again and again, across generations, the cycle renewed itself. Innocence devoured, power justified, cruelty ritualized. And yet, human appetite never rests at custom. Once normalized, it seeks excess. Once ritualized, it demands spectacle. The symposia that began with poetry and wine would evolve into something darker, sexual theater designed not only to gratify but to degrade, punish, and terrorize. What you have seen so far is the preparation. The next step descends into the abyss itself, where the powerful invented grotesque cruelties that turned the body into a weapon, humiliation into entertainment, and suffering into the very definition of power. Now, let us enter the abyss of depravity. You have already seen the rituals, the institutions, the brothels. the festivals that clothed appetite in the garments of culture. But beneath them lay a darker current, one that needed no disguise. This was the point at which indulgence became invention, when cruelty ceased to be collateral and became the very goal. Greece, for all its temples and philosophers, learned how to turn bodies into stages, pain into spectacle, and humiliation into a ritual of power. This is where the descent quickens. The symposium was already theater, but in some houses it became literal. Imagine the couches pushed back, the lamps brightened, the crater filled for another round. Guests call for entertainment, and what enters is not a flute girl or a dancer, but a pair of slaves ordered to couple before a crowd. Laughter, commentary, wagers follow. Sometimes the performance is forced parody. A man dressed as Zeus enacts a myth of divine seduction, while a trembling slave girl plays Dana or Europa. The humiliation was doubled. The myth gave it precedent, the audience gave it permanence. What was once sacred story became degrading skit, stripping gods and mortals alike of dignity. Those watching toasted the irony, as if cleverness erased cruelty. Other times, the theater took the form of contests. Who could last longest? Who could endure the most commands? Who could be broken fastest? Men wagered on the outcome, while the subjects themselves had no voice. It was not merely indulgence. It was domination crystallized into entertainment. Beyond theater, there was experimentation. Physicians of antiquity, men like Hippocrates or later Galen, wrote clinically about bodies, diseases, and fluids. But beneath the noble pursuit of medicine, some practiced a different kind of inquiry. Slaves, stripped of status, became subjects for crude research. There are scattered references to experiments on arousal, on fertility, on anatomy, acts justified as knowledge while functioning as sanctioned violation. Consider the atmosphere, a room not unlike a symposium, but with knives and oils instead of lyres. The body of a woman, pinned not for pleasure but for dissection of what was called nature. Questions of reproduction, menstruation, conception, answered not through consent, but through coercion. For the Greeks, curiosity was divine, but curiosity married to power became monstrous. Again and again, the body was framed as material, whether for philosophy, for comedy, or for science. The boundary between inquiry and abuse vanished when the subject could not refuse. Sex was not only pleasure in Greece, it was also punishment. Slaves who disobeyed might be forced into degrading acts before their masters. Captives in war could be humiliated in ways meant to erase their dignity permanently. Ancient chroniclers describe victors parading conquered men dressed in women's garments, forcing them into roles that symbolized their defeat. Sexual punishment was a tool to mark subjugation indelibly. It communicated to all watching, this man is no longer free, this woman no longer untouchable. In a society where reputation was everything, the shame of exposure was a weapon sharper than bronze. Consider also the theater stage itself. Aristophanes' comedies, brilliant, biting, were filled with sexual humor that turned ridicule into civic entertainment. Masks with exaggerated genitals, actors miming obscenities, audiences roaring with laughter. The line between comedy and cruelty dissolved when those ridiculed were already powerless. Athens called it art. The victims experienced it as annihilation. If institutions normalized these practices, tyrants magnified them. History remembers the names of men whose appetites swallowed all boundaries. Pisistratus of Athens, though more politically cunning than depraved, paved the way for rule cloaked in spectacle. Later tyrants across the Greek world, Polycrates of Samos, the Dionysii of Syracuse, were whispered to have indulged in grotesque sexual excess, their power insulating them from consequence. And even within Athens, generals and politicians participated in symposia that blurred into cruelty. Alcibiades, the golden youth turned traitor, was notorious for both seducing and humiliating. Accusations swirled that he mocked sacred rites, that he defiled not only people but gods themselves. To Athens, his brilliance excused much. His downfall was political, not moral. It is telling, in a society where philosophers debated the nature of virtue daily, sexual cruelty was rarely grounds for condemnation. The charge that destroyed reputations was not exploitation, but failing to dominate. This is where the slope steepens most dangerously. Once a society accepts the body as property, it does not remain satisfied with repetition. Appetite craves novelty, and novelty often means escalation. At first, the spectacle shocks. Then it entertains. Then it bores. And boredom, in the hands of the powerful, becomes lethal. So, men invent new humiliations, new scripts, new ways to transform another's suffering into momentary diversion. Imagine the paranoia of a man who has everything: wealth, influence, slaves, lovers, and feels it slipping with every passing year. His answer is not moderation but excess, as if cruelty could anchor his authority. Victims become mirrors of his fear, screens onto which he projects the dread of mortality. Again and again, the same rituals repeat, louder, harsher, more grotesque. This psychological decay is visible in the sources. Plays grow bawdier, vase paintings more explicit, anecdotes more lurid. The appetite of a civilization begins to cannibalize itself. By the time of Alexander the Great, Greek influence had spread across half the known world. His court became infamous for its blend of brilliance and debauchery. While Alexander himself is remembered more for conquest than indulgence, the generals and successors who followed him transformed symposium culture into something even darker. At the lavish banquets of Ptolemaic Egypt or Seleucid Syria, guests drowned in wine while slaves performed acts of humiliation as entertainment. These were echoes of Athens amplified by empire. What had once been localized ritual became globalized decadence. Thus, the glory of Greece was exported along with its philosophy and art. The statues and the sciences traveled hand in hand with the cruelty. At its peak, the depravity no longer needed excuses. It existed as its own justification. Festivals where frenzy excused violation, brothels where the state sold human bodies as taxable property, symposia where cruelty was theater, tyrants who made humiliation a political tool, all converged into a culture where innocence had no sanctuary. The abyss is this: not isolated acts of cruelty, but their codification as normal. When a civilization engraves its horrors into art, into law, into religion, it ensures they will endure beyond memory. The laughter of one night's symposium becomes the motif on a vase, sold in the agora, admired centuries later in a museum. The victims disappear, but the pattern survives. Pause and look again at the contradiction. This same civilization gave us democracy, tragedy, philosophy, sculpture. It built the Parthenon, taught the world to reason, produced ideals of beauty still admired. Yet behind the marble and the mathematics lay this abyss, unspoken yet essential. The glory and the horror were not opposites, they were twins, born of the same parents. The philosophers who debated virtue reclined on couches where slaves were humiliated. The generals who defended freedom enforced subjugation through sexual punishment. The artists who carved gods into stone painted obscene acts onto pottery. Civilization and corruption were not at war, they were in collusion, and yet power never lasts forever. Even the most secure tyrant eventually falls, the most radiant city crumbles, the most elaborate festival fades. Athens would fall to Sparta, Sparta to Thebes, Thebes to Macedon, Greece itself to Rome. The rituals did not vanish, they transformed, inherited, magnified. But the individuals who performed them, the men who believed themselves gods, could not escape the mortality they so desperately tried to forget in the arms of cruelty. The abyss consumed not only the victims, but, in time, the hosts as well. The laughter of the symposium fell silent, the lamps burned out, the victims buried nameless. What remained was memory, distorted by time, preserved in fragments, judged by history. Now we move toward resolution, the collapse of these men, these practices, these civilizations. For cruelty always devours its host, and only in the ruins can we take the measure of what was truly lost. The lamps are out now. The symposium couches are empty, their cushions rotting in the dust of centuries. Athens has long since fallen, first to Sparta, then to Thebes, then to Macedon. The marble temples still stand, but they are ruins, their brilliance dulled by time and weather. The laughter that once masked darker sounds has vanished into silence. Yet the echoes of what happened behind those walls, in those brothels and sanctuaries, still linger. Civilization's memory does not forget, it reshapes. Athens, so proud of its reason and democracy, fractured under its own contradictions. War drained its strength, plague thinned its citizens, and arrogance bred betrayal. The rituals of pleasure and humiliation did not vanish with defeat, they were absorbed, altered, adapted. Sparta, too, would collapse, its state-sponsored mentorships and rigid discipline giving way to weakness. The cycle of conquest devoured them all. Rome arrived to inherit the mantle. And with Rome came a magnification. Greek practices carried across the Mediterranean, amplified in amphitheaters and imperial palaces. Where Athens had staged humiliation in private rooms, Rome made it public, feeding slaves and captives to crowds and spectacles of violence. The Greeks had laid the foundation. The Romans built the Colosseum upon it. Yet amid the grandeur of collapse, the victims remained shadows. The Thracian girl sold in the marketplace, the Athenian boy paraded at a symposium, the slave ordered to perform for laughter. None of their names survive. Their suffering was written into no law, carved into no marble, recorded in no annals of victory. Civilization erased them even as it displayed them. Still, fragments survive. A vase showing a trembling youth before his elder, a line in Aristophanes mocking what the audience knew too well, a philosopher's defense of custom that reads, "To modernize as confession." These fragments are the only gravestones the victims ever received. History, however, judges differently than contemporaries. What Athens celebrated as tradition, we see as violation. What philosophers, cloaked in rhetoric, we unmask as cruelty. Time exposes the contradiction. The same hands that carved the Parthenon also codified exploitation. Civilization's shine was built upon silence, its temples upon bodies. This is the mask cracking. The revelation that what we revere as brilliance cannot be separated from the abyss it concealed. To admire Greece fully, one must see both faces, the marble and the scars, the philosophy and the pain. And so the story ends not with triumph, but with reckoning. Power always corrupts, and in Greece it corrupted by making cruelty appear rational, even sacred. Again and again, appetite disguised itself as tradition, and tradition became law. The victims were forgotten, but the structure remained. This is why history matters. Because civilizations do not collapse from beauty alone, nor from brilliance, but from the rot they hide beneath the surface. Athens gave the world democracy, art, philosophy, but also brothels, perversions, and rituals of humiliation. To see only one is to misunderstand both. The lamps are extinguished, the laughter gone, the victims nameless. But their silence is part of civilization's memory. We cannot change their fate, but we can refuse to forget it. And in remembering, we are reminded that the line between brilliance and barbarity is always thinner than marble, always fragile as smoke. This was Greece, the cradle of reason and the cradle of cruelty.